As I thought about what I wanted to share with you this evening, a lot of different thoughts went through my mind. And I thought, probably the best thing to do, I'm going to try to do a little bit of informing, a little bit of encouraging, and a little bit of challenging. And if I don't succeed in any of those, at least I hope you come away somewhat entertained by some of the things that I might tell you. Look, I don't know how you feel, but I think that the argument could be made that we are more divided today as a nation than we have been since the Civil War. We are divided politically, socially, culturally, racially, spiritually, ideologically. There is not an adjective that describes our being across which we are not divided as a nation. The informing part of my presentation is to kind of guide you through a path that I believe that has brought us to this point. If you look back at our nation's history, it tells the story. And I'm going to share that with you. But before I do that, let me tell you what my makeup is. I was not born and raised in the gilded halls of Congress. I'm a two-wheel wagon rut mule farming plowboy from the cotton and tobacco farms of North Carolina. I was born on a little mule farm, no indoor plumbing, heated and cooked on two big old black pot-bellied stoves. I told that story once to a group that I was speaking to in Washington, D.C., and the host of the event stopped me and he said, that's crazy. Someone your age farming with mules. Why didn't you use a tractor? I said, well, we didn't have a tractor. He said, why didn't you borrow one? I said, sir, you don't understand. The side of the tracks I came from, we had to borrow the stinking mule. My grandfather and I would walk for a couple of miles. He'd carried two big old 5-gallon buckets of corn. And that was our honorarium to the neighboring farmer that would let us use his mule to plow the fields to grow the produce that we consumed. Every day was a survival day. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. If you didn't work, you stayed cold. We didn't have to worry about staying hot because there was no air conditioner. You were just going to be hot in the summertime. But my grandfather was the superintendent of the little local church in the community. And as I recall, the church didn't have any electricity, so it didn't have a buzzer or a bell to sound that it was time to start Sunday school. He would go and he would pull a rope that was attached to a big old bell in the steeple. And he would take me to church with him, and he'd let me hang on to that rope. And he would pull the rope down, and I would grab it, and it would sling me up into the rafters. And it was like, for me, that was Disney World. I mean, that was a ride. And my grandfather would stand down below me, and he would, with a broad grin, he was not a man of many words, but he made sure that I knew that I could trust him, that he would catch me if I fell. It was in the back room of that little church that I first heard the stories of Moses, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, King David, and of course, our Savior, Jesus Christ. It was a few years later, my mother we left that little farm. My mother and my sister wasn't born at that time. But we left that little farm because my mother started running from my dad. It was a dysfunctional home. My dad was an alcoholic, a mean alcoholic. Mom spent more time running from him than she did living with him. So it was nothing unusual for me to wake up in the middle of the night with a whisper saying, "Come on, we're leaving." I went to 13 schools in 12 years. I can't count the number of different schools I went to in the middle of a year. So I struggled through school for the most part. But in the 5th grade, we wound up in a little housing project in Durham, North Carolina. And I noticed that on most every other day of the week, there were a lot of kids playing out in the quad where we all got together. But on Sundays, you couldn't find a dog to play with. There was nobody out there. So I asked a friend of mine, "Where does everybody go on Sunday?" He said, "Well, there's this little blue bus that comes through the complex. And we all get on it, and it takes us down to this little church. They got donuts and juice and stuff. So you ought to come and go with us." So my mother was working 2 jobs at the time. Back in those days, you could do what I'm about to tell you. I got my little sister up on Sunday morning. She hadn't even started to school yet. Got her dressed. I got dressed. We got off on that little school bus and went to that little church. And they did have juice and donuts and stuff. Now, I can't tell you what the preacher preached that day. I can't tell you what his name is. But I can tell you when the altar call came, something happened to me. And I met Christ from a perspective that I had never met him before. I knew about him, but I didn't know him until that day. And my life was never the same after that. I don't even have enough time this evening to tell you all the times that God has picked me up, literally picked me up from a bad situation and protected me and set me aside in situations that I could not handle on my own. It would take me hours to go through all of that with you. But I made it through school. After high school, joined the Air Force. Spent 26 and a half years in the Air Force. That's what took me to Tampa when I met Mike. Grew to have a love for our country that is unexplainable. Studied our nation's history, both from a military perspective, a political perspective, a historical perspective. Started my own businesses after I left the Air Force. Did that for about 10 years. And then someone decided one day that I should throw my hat in the ring and run for the U.S. House of Representatives. I thought they were crazy. I'd never done anything like that before. Politics were not in my family. My family didn't do things like that. We came from the other side of the tracks, where the pot-bellied stoves and the slop jars were. You guys know what slop jars are? Anybody in here know what a slop jar is? Well, if you use an outside restroom, outside bathroom at night, you don't want to get up and walk outside when it's cold. Slop jars are little porcelain pots with lids on them. That's the side of the tracks that we came from. And so when somebody suggested that I run for the U.S. House, I thought they were nuts. But God had a different design. And history now tells what happened, and I'm here. But I studied our nation's history, our lineage, our legacy, from every angle that you can imagine. And so some of what I'm going to share with you are simply my thoughts as I've pieced together what happened over our nation's history. We talk about being divided today, and I said we're more divided today than we have been since the Civil War. Let's go back to 1868, thereabouts, the end of the Civil War. I think you could say that we have never been more divided than we were then. Many in President Lincoln's inner circle tried to get him to punish the southern states because of the egregious actions that they took that divided us at that time. Over 1.3 million Americans have died in conflict for the cause of freedom, and over 700,000 of them died in the Civil War at our own hands. Folks, we're not afraid to kill each other in this country over political and ideological differences. And we've demonstrated that in the past. But Lincoln said no. Punishing the southern states is not the right thing to do. You remember his famous words, "A house divided cannot stand." He said the rest of the world is looking and watching, waiting to see if America really believes this idea of self-governance. Is it going to work? Those inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that are endowed to us by the Creator that ordained us in the first place. Do they believe that? And with the stroke of a pen, he forgave the ills of the southern states. And we began to march forward as one nation. The testimony of the power of his actions. And I believe that the Holy Spirit led the president to do what he did. Because the power of his actions can be found less than a generation later. When we healed our internal wounds and came together in 1917, mobilized from scratch to enter World War I and fight off tyranny in Europe. Less than a half a generation after that, to remobilize and fight off tyranny in Europe once again in World War II. The same thing in Korea. And if you look at the 100-year period from 1868 to roughly 1970, let's round it off, it's 102 years, but we'll say a century. I think the argument could be made that that was the most explosive, innovative period, not only of American history, but of human history thus far. Think about what America brought to the world during that century. The combustion engine, the invention of the automobile, mass production of automobiles, the assembly line, the manufacturing process, the industrialization of Western cultures, the light bulb, the airplane, powered flight, space travel, landing a man on the moon, organ transplants, medical advances like we'd never seen before, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, up until 1970. Start the clock now at 1970, and let's look at what's happened since then. What's the big thing? What are the big things? Is there a list of those human condition changing innovations like I just listed off that happened in that first century, 1868 to 1970? Most of the time when I ask the question, what are the big things that's happened since 1970, the answer I get is the internet, iPhones, iPads, mobile devices, communicating technologies, right? Why do you think that the internet flourished over that time period? It's because it's the only industry that the federal government could not figure out how to regulate. And still to this day, they haven't figured it out. And it's an everyday battle to keep them from doing it. But if you look at 1970, that's when we began to change our attitudes. Two things happened. The first thing that happened was big government began to emerge. Nixon brought in the EPA. Carter brought in the Department of Education and the Department of Energy. And I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not against government's role in advancing the human cause and in advancing America's prosperity. I'm not against that at all. But I am against big government squelching the innovative and ingenuity spirit of the American people. And I believe that that's what happened. In the early 70s, the federal government began to tell the American people not only what to innovate, but when, where, why, how, and in many cases, picking winners and losers and telling who could innovate. Another thing happened. The second thing that happened about that time, a phenomenon that is repeating itself today. How many of you were raised in the 60s? Some of you, don't be shy now, because some of you, I can tell by the color of your hair, you were. I was born in the 50s, raised in the 60s. The American people saw something in the 1960s that they had never seen before. And it changed who America became starting in the 70s. The American people saw war and all of its horror up close and personal, as Walter Cronkite would bring the body count and the horrific images from the battlefields in Vietnam into the living rooms of the American people every night. It played out in the streets of our cities. It played out on our college campuses. For those of you that have seen the documentaries or lived through it, you can remember the anti-war riots. People at home right here were killed as a result of some of those actions. It created a me generation. Make love, not war. If it feels good, do it. If big government can fight an unlawful war, what right do they have to tell me what to do? The American people began to lose confidence in our system. And the media learned that they could manipulate the American people's thought process. A similar phenomenon is happening today. About 10, 15 years ago, roughly, the 24-hour-a-day opinion or news cycle emerged in American society. And between the 24-hour-a-day news cycle and the social media networks, the American people are now seeing something, a new something that they've never seen before. They're seeing inside of the political and governing machinery of the United States with a microscope, from a perspective that they've never seen it before. Name me a country on the planet that opens its doors and is that transparent. I'm not making a judgment on that being wrong or right. I'm just making an observation that that is what has happened. And because of our education system, we don't teach civics in high school anymore. Our education institutions, many of them, are leading our young people in a very different direction than when I was brought up. The American people are looking at this phenomenon, and they're looking inside of the sausage-making machinery of our federal government, and they're saying, wow, I don't like what I see there. And they're coming to the conclusion, many of us are, that this gridlock, the anxiety, the partisanship that exists here in our nation's capital and probably in others, in states as well, that's some kind of new phenomenon. That it just started happening over the last 10, 15 years. Well, folks, that's not true. It has been difficult to govern our nation from the very beginning. Go back and read the writings. Don't take my word for it. Go read the writings of Madison and Washington and Adams and Jefferson. Here's what you'll find out. Look at the summer of 1787. Washington and Madison went into that summer. Close allies, partners, to write the Constitution of the United States. I think it is a miracle from heaven that we ended up with the Constitution that summer. They got so crossways with one another about what would be in, what would be out, arguing about this, arguing about that Washington and Madison hardly even spoke to each other again after that summer for the rest of their lives. America has always had big problems to solve. We always will have big problems to solve. Every generation's little problems are the next generation's big problems. It's all relevant. It's like a marriage. We constantly look and think we're going to find grass greener on the other side, that there's something we can do to our system to make it different. Folks, that's the nature of a representative republic in a system where the power resides in the governed. And the media has learned to exploit this. If Michael O'Fallon and I are in the 7th grade and we tell our 7th grade class that we're going to have a fist fight on the playground at recess, where do you think everybody's going to go at recess in that 7th grade class? They're going to go to the playground, circle up on the basketball court. They know Bill is old and slow and he's not very tough, and they're going to watch Michael beat him up. Nobody wants to talk to Susie or Johnny that tells the teacher, hey, you better watch out, there's going to be a fight on the playground. Better make sure there's some teachers out there. Because the idea of responsibility and accountability are negatives today, especially in the world of journalism. Where today, between the 24-hour news cycle and the social media networks, the American people are told what's important, what to think about what's important, and who we can and cannot vote for. Folks, we are being led around like sheep or cattle with rings in our noses. Why are we falling to this kind of deception? This is where the encouraging part comes. I've now informed you on how we got into this mess. Let me encourage you a little bit, because the Bible speaks of it. Did you know that there is an intersection in the Bible between religion or faith, not religion, faith and politics? Read Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6 reads like a 2-year session of Congress. I'll paraphrase it for you. Daniel was a commissioner, a satrap, appointed by the king, had the favor of the king. The king liked Daniel more than the rest. Daniel was one of 3 leaders, commissioners over the satraps. He was like House leadership, Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise. The other commissioners and satraps didn't like it that Daniel had that kind of favor with the king. And so they conspired against him. You know the story from your Sunday school classes. We all remember it. Daniel was thrown in the lion's den. And we know that part of the story, and we know that God spared Daniel. So when the king looked down in the pit and he said, "Hey Daniel, did your God spare you?" I don't think the king actually expected to hear a voice coming back up, right? He thought the worst. What did Daniel say? Did Daniel say, "You low down, no good, low life king, I served you, I stood with you, I was by your side, and you let these guys lie about me, and you threw me in the lion's den"? That's not what he said at all. He said, "I'm your man, king. Long live the king. But yes, God has spared me. And I'm going to be your guy. I'm just not going to compromise my faith." We know the story of God saving Daniel in the lion's den, but we don't ever think about Daniel's conduct during that process. Daniel never struck out at the king, never went to the local scribes and complained, took it to the press, right? He didn't go to the other commissioners or the other satraps and talk down to them, "You low down dirty scoundrels," right? Because Daniel knew something that many of us as believers have forgotten. Daniel knew that he wasn't there to do God's job. Daniel wasn't the changer of the king's heart, nor those that he was serving with. Daniel was the change agent. The Bible tells us that we should so let our light shine before men that we draw them, that Christ draws them. We're like a beacon. In Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 4, it ain't that tough, folks. It ain't that tough. The Bible tells us the story. We only hear about him one time. Jabez. The Bible says he was a righteous man. And that he prayed before the Lord. And he said, "Oh God, that you would bless me indeed. That you would expand my territory. That your hand would be upon me and that you would keep me from evil, that I might not cause pain." And the Bible said because Jabez was a righteous man, he answered his prayer. Notice that he didn't say because Jabez was a perfect man. He said because Jabez was a righteous man. You see, God doesn't expect us to be perfect. He expects us to be obedient and to be righteous in the sense that we follow after Him. I liked your analogy, Pastor, when you talked about the empty hand. So how do we get out of this quagmire that we're in? We've got to get back to the central truth about why we were created here in the first place. We were not created to fight with one another. Not among Christians, not among politicians. I can tell you that there are a lot of members of Congress, both on the Senate side and in the House, that are God-fearing, Bible-believing, Christ-following people. There are others who think they are. And maybe they are. I'm not their judge. But they're babes in Christ. Because they're falling for the deceit that's coming across the airwaves and coming across the internet. In John chapter 8, verses 31 and 32, these are the words that Jesus spoke. To the Jews that believed him, he said, "Abide in my word, and you will truly be my disciples, and you will see the truth, and the truth will set you free." Folks, the reason that we fall for every scheme of the devil and every scheme of lies and deception that come across the national media, and they all do it. They all do it. Is because we have lost our relationship with the author of the truth. We can't see the truth because we don't have a relationship with the author of truth. My challenge to you is don't believe everything that you see and hear on national television about the situation here in our nation's capital. They're trying to instigate that fight between Michael and Bill, whether it's between Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, or Mitch and the president, or Corker and Flake against the president, you name it, they're trying to instigate it. They're standing on the outside of the campfire with a can of gasoline, and every time it simmers down a little bit, they'll douse it up again. Don't believe everything that you see and hear on national television. America is still the greatest nation on the planet. We are God ordained to be who we are. That is the only rational explanation for our journey from where we started to where we are today. Don't fall for the deception. And then secondly, do some personal reflection. That's easy to say. It's not so easy to do. But I can tell you that America's problems are not head problems. America's problems today are heart problems. Because we've never had a head problem that we couldn't solve. It's the heart problems that we're not so good at sometimes. Folks, it's a great day to be an American. This is still the best place in the world to live, to raise a family, to work. And it starts with each and every one of us as individuals to make a difference in our little circle of influence. I tell young people all the time, I'm going to walk out of my office one of these days and I'm not coming back. We've got two young ladies sitting right over here. So I'll tell you, one of these days it's going to be your turn to take the reins of leadership. You're going to have to be ready when that time comes. Because every generation in America gets the unbelievable privilege of writing the next great chapter of American history, because we are far from a finished product. We are a work in progress. We started out that way, and we will perpetually forever be that way. We're not like the great nations of Europe or Asia, where the dictator or the prime minister or the parliament can resign and abolish the Constitution and rewrite it and start all over again. That's not the way our system works, folks. We are in it together for the long haul, and we got to keep putting one foot in front of the other. I am proud to be an American. I am proud to be a Christian. and you can hold your head up and be optimistic, America's not falling apart. There are those who would like you to believe that we are. And that's what Sovereign Nations is all about. Standing and pushing back on some of that deceitful message. Each one of us plays a role in that. If you haven't been informed, encouraged, or challenged, I hope you've been entertained. Thank you so much for having me this evening. It's an honor to be with you.